Awaken your spirit chosen ones. When people start talking about you louder than you're talking about yourself, it usually means they can feel something changing around you before they can explain it. Here's something most people don't realize. Throughout history, long before individuals stepped into visible influence, leadership, or breakthrough moments in their lives, there was almost always a strange phase that came first, a phase where people started reacting to them differently for no clear reason. Conversations shifted, rumors appeared out of nowhere, observers became critics overnight, supporters became quiet spectators, and the most confusing part, nothing obvious had even happened yet. That phase is what we're talking about today. Because if people are suddenly making noise about you, talking about you more than usual, watching you differently, reacting emotionally to your presence, or behaving in ways that even they don't recognize in themselves, it's rarely random. Human beings are predictable in one strange way. They get loud when they don't understand what they're sensing. And here's the part nobody explains. Most people don't talk this much about someone unless something about that person is quietly disrupting the normal order they're used to. When someone begins evolving internally, not loudly, not publicly, not dramatically, but deeply, observers feel it before they can logically describe it. It's like when the weather changes before the storm arrives. Nobody sees the lightning yet, but suddenly everybody is looking at the sky. Now let's be honest for a second. If people are acting unusual around you lately, whispering more than usual, reacting stronger than expected, or behaving like you accidentally pressed some invisible emotional alarm button you didn't even know existed, congratulations, you didn't press a button, you walked into a signal range. And sometimes the funniest part is this. The louder people become about you, the quieter the reason actually is. They're not reacting to what you did, they're reacting to what they sense is happening. So if you've ever looked around and thought, why are they suddenly acting like this? Stay with me, because what you're about to understand might completely change how you interpret the noise around your name. Number one, they are reacting to a version of themselves they buried long ago. One of the most uncomfortable truths about why people suddenly start making noise about you is this. Sometimes your presence reminds them of who they were supposed to become before life convinced them to shrink. Most people don't wake up one day and decide to live smaller lives. It happens slowly. A dream gets postponed. A truth gets swallowed. A boundary gets ignored. A risk gets avoided. Over time, they adjust to surviving instead of becoming. And eventually, they stop noticing what they gave up. Then someone like you shows up. You may not even be doing anything dramatic. You're just being honest in ways they stopped being honest. Standing firm where they learned to bend. Moving forward without asking permission from rooms that trained them to wait. And suddenly, something inside them starts feeling restless again. That restlessness doesn't always turn into admiration. Sometimes it turns into noise. Because when people see someone walking a path they secretly abandoned, it brings back questions they worked very hard to silence. Questions like, what happened to me? Or, why didn't I try harder? Or, could I have chosen differently? Those questions are heavy. And instead of carrying that weight, many people push it away by talking about you instead. So they analyze you, they question you, they misunderstand you loudly, they react stronger than the situation even deserves. Not because you attacked them, but because you reminded them of something unfinished inside themselves. This is why their reactions sometimes feel confusing. You didn't compete with them, you didn't challenge them, you didn't even confront them. Yet they behave like something important is at stake. Something is at stake. Your existence quietly proves that the version of themselves they once believed in is still possible. And for some people, that realization is inspiring. But for others, it's uncomfortable enough to make them talk about you far more than they planned to. Number two, They cannot categorize you fast enough to feel safe. Most people move through life by quickly deciding who others are. It's something the brain does automatically. It wants shortcuts. It wants simple labels: safe person, threat, follower, leader, quiet one, loud one, predictable one, useful one. Once someone fits into a category, people relax because they feel like they understand what to expect. But something different happens when they meet someone they can't place. When people can't figure you out quickly, their mind doesn't settle. It keeps working. It keeps watching. It keeps trying to make sense of you. And that mental effort creates tension. Not danger, not dislike, just tension from uncertainty. That tension is what turns into noise. They start talking about you more than usual. They compare notes with others. They ask questions that sound casual but are actually investigations. They try to study your reactions. They replay conversations they had with you. Some even start making assumptions just to give their mind something solid to hold on to. Because uncertainty makes people uncomfortable. Most social environments depend on predictability. People feel calmer when they believe they already understand someone's limits, personality, and behavior patterns. But when someone shows depth they didn't expect, calmness disappears, and suddenly they start reacting louder than the situation deserves. Sometimes they call you mysterious. Sometimes they say you're hard to read. Sometimes they act like you're hiding something when the truth is simple. They just can't label you fast enough. And when someone cannot label you, they cannot control how they respond to you either. That's what really unsettles them. It's not that you did something confusing. It's that your presence doesn't fit inside their usual system for understanding people. So instead of adjusting their system, they talk more about you. The noise you're hearing is not random conversation. It's their mind trying to create certainty where certainty hasn't arrived yet. Number 3. Your restraint makes aggressive personalities panic. There is something deeply unsettling for certain people when they come across someone who does not react the way they expect. Not because they are peaceful, but because they are unreadable in motion. They expect emotion to follow a pattern. Pressure comes in, reaction comes out. Insult comes in, defense comes out. Praise comes in, excitement comes out. That rhythm is what they rely on to understand control in social situations. But when you don't follow that rhythm, something changes in them. Your restraint interrupts their expectations. You don't explode when they expect explosion. You don't argue when they expect argument. You don't over-explain when they expect justification. You don't fall apart when they expect weakness. And this creates confusion that many aggressive personalities don't know how to process. Because for them, reaction is confirmation. If they push and you react, they feel powerful. If they push and you don't react, they feel like the system is broken. And people don't like systems they can't predict. So instead of adjusting themselves, they increase the pressure. They talk more. They test more. They exaggerate situations. They try different angles to pull something out of you that feels familiar to them. It's not always hatred. Sometimes it's discomfort. Sometimes it's frustration. Sometimes it's a need to regain emotional balance. But it always creates noise. What they don't realize is that your restraint is not emptiness. It is control. It is awareness. It is choice. And that kind of behavior removes the emotional leverage they expect to have over people. So they escalate verbally because they cannot escalate emotionally in you. They try to create a reaction externally because they cannot trigger one internally. And that imbalance makes them even louder. In simple terms, your calm, where they expected chaos, feels like losing influence over you. And for some personalities, losing that influence is more uncomfortable than conflict itself. Number 4, they sense influence around you before they see results from you. Most people assume influence only exists when there is something visible to point at. money, status, followers, recognition, titles. But in reality, human perception doesn't wait for results before it starts reacting. People often feel influence before they can prove it. They just don't always know how to explain what they're feeling. That is where the noise begins. When someone carries a certain level of internal shift, it changes how others respond to them long before anything external confirms it. People become more alert around them. Conversations about them increase without any clear reason. Their name starts appearing in discussions they were not part of, not because they forced attention, but because attention naturally starts moving toward them. And here's the strange part. Most people don't recognize influence directly. They recognize its effects. They notice themselves thinking about you more often than expected. They notice they remember things you said longer than normal. They notice that others are also mentioning you independently. So instead of calling it influence, they start trying to interpret it in other ways. This is where misunderstanding begins. Some people become curious. Some become skeptical. Some become defensive. Some become overly vocal about you, as if speaking louder will reduce the feeling they cannot explain. But the feeling doesn't go away just because they talk about it. If anything, it increases their awareness of it. Influence at this stage is not about power over people. It is about presence that sticks in their awareness longer than expected. It creates a kind of mental echo. Even when you are not present, something about you remains in their thoughts longer than it should. And when people cannot logically explain why someone stays in their mind, they often start filling the gap with conversation. That is why the noise increases. It is their attempt to turn a feeling into something understandable. So the reaction is not always about what you are doing outwardly. It is about what is already happening in how people register you internally before you have even arrived in the way they expect. Number 5, your independence exposes how controlled most people actually are. Most people don't realize how much of their life is shaped by invisible agreements they never consciously signed. They follow patterns because it feels safer, not because they question them. They choose paths that are already approved by their environment. They speak in ways that reduce conflict. They adjust their behavior to avoid standing out too much. Over time, this becomes normal to them, and they start believing it is freedom. Then they meet someone who doesn't operate like that. Your independence doesn't have to be loud to be noticeable. It can be something simple. You don't rush to get approval before you move. You don't constantly explain your decisions. You don't change direction just because others are uncomfortable with your choices. You don't treat permission as a requirement for action. You simply act based on your own understanding. And that alone unsettles people more than they admit, because your behavior quietly exposes how often they pause their own life to check if it is socially acceptable first. They may not say it directly, but they feel it. They notice that you are not waiting for validation the way they are used to doing. And that creates a silent comparison in their mind. Instead of questioning their own patterns, many people externalize that discomfort. They start talking about you more. They interpret your independence as arrogance, carelessness, or unpredictability. Not because it is true, but because it is easier than admitting they are conditioned to seek approval before action. Your independence becomes a mirror they didn't agree to look into. And when people see something in you that reflects what they are not doing themselves, they don't always respond with reflection. Sometimes they respond with resistance. They try to reduce your behavior into something understandable, something flawed, something dismissible. The noise is not always about disagreement. Sometimes it is about discomfort, because your freedom makes their limitations more visible than they are willing to acknowledge. Number 6, They are trying to test whether your confidence is real or temporary. A lot of people don't trust confidence when they first see it, especially when it doesn't come with loud explanations or constant validation. They assume it has to be maintained by reactions, by approval, or by visible proof every time. So when they meet someone who stays steady without constantly proving themselves, it creates doubt in their mind. Not doubt about you directly at first. Doubt about whether what they are seeing can last. So they test it. Sometimes the test is subtle. A strange comment, a slight challenge in tone, a passive remark disguised as humor. Other times it is more obvious. They push boundaries just a little to see if your energy changes. They say things that are slightly disrespectful just to watch your reaction. They create small moments of pressure to see if your composure shifts. It is not always conscious. Many people don't even realize they are doing it. It happens automatically when they encounter something stable that they are not used to. Because in their experience, most confidence has conditions. It holds up until it is questioned. It stays strong until it is ignored. It feels stable until it is challenged. So when they meet someone who does not follow that pattern, they become curious in a way that turns into testing behavior. What they are really looking for is confirmation that you will eventually break character, that your calm is situational, that your confidence depends on comfort, that your presence can be shaken like everyone else's. And when they don't get that confirmation, their behavior often escalates into more discussion about you. They start talking about you to others, not just to observe you, but to gather collective opinions that help them understand you better. But the core issue remains the same. They are trying to place limits on something that doesn't easily show limits. And when limits are not visible, people tend to talk more, watch more, and test more. Number 7. They expected you to remain explainable. Most people are comfortable with others as long as they can quickly describe them. Not in a deep way, just in a simple sentence that makes sense to them. This person is like this, that person is like that. Once someone fits into a neat explanation, they feel secure around them because there are no surprises left to process. But the moment you stop fitting into that simple explanation, something changes in how people relate to you. At first, they may still try to hold on to the old version of you. They repeat assumptions that used to make sense. They talk about you using outdated impressions. They describe you in ways that no longer match your current behavior. It is not always intentional. It is just their mind trying to preserve familiarity. But as time passes, that explanation starts to fail them. You react differently in situations they thought they already understood. You make decisions they didn't expect. You handle pressure in ways that don't match their prediction of you. You stay calm where they expected chaos, or you stay distant where they expected emotion. And slowly, their simple version of you stops working. That is where confusion begins, because when someone can no longer explain you in a sentence or two, they are forced into something they don't enjoy doing, paying closer attention, re-evaluating assumptions, adjusting their mental image of you. And most people don't like doing that repeatedly, so instead they start talking about you more. Not because they have new information, but because they are trying to rebuild understanding through conversation. They discuss you with others to see if their confusion is shared. They compare experiences. They try to confirm whether you have changed or whether they misunderstood you from the start. And in doing that, your presence becomes a topic more than a person. The noise is not always about judgment. Sometimes it is about people trying to restore a sense of clarity they lost when their explanation of you stopped being enough. Number 8. They are disturbed by how calm you are around dishonesty. Most people are used to one of two reactions when dishonesty shows up. Either someone reacts immediately with anger, confrontation, or emotional escalation, or they quietly accept it and later complain about it elsewhere. Those are the two patterns they expect, because those patterns are predictable and easy to read. But when someone stays calm in the presence of dishonesty without pretending it didn't happen, and without reacting in a way that gives emotional fuel, it creates discomfort in others. Not because calmness is weak, but because it is unfamiliar in that context. When you respond without overreacting, people who are used to manipulation, exaggeration, or selective truth feel something shift. It becomes harder for them to control the emotional direction of the situation. They cannot easily pull you into drama, and they cannot easily dismiss your awareness either. You are simply present, aware, and unaffected in the way they expect people not to be. That kind of response creates tension, because dishonesty often relies on emotional reaction to survive. It needs confusion, escalation, or emotional imbalance to gain control of the situation. But when you remain steady, the usual patterns stop working. There is nothing to escalate, nothing to twist, nothing to pull you into. So instead of direct confrontation, people begin to talk about you more. They reinterpret your calm as something else. They may call it arrogance, detachment, or suspicion, not because your behavior is unclear, but because your lack of reaction makes them unsure how much you actually understand. And uncertainty makes people uncomfortable. They start wondering what you noticed, what you chose not to respond to, what you are storing mentally without saying out loud. Your silence in those moments doesn't feel empty to them. It feels observant. So the noise grows around you, not because you are reacting, but because you are not reacting in the way they are used to controlling. Number 9. They hoped your endurance had a breaking point they could predict. Most people are comfortable with strength only when they believe it has limits they can understand. It makes them feel safe when they assume that everyone eventually reacts the same way under pressure. If something is pushed far enough, it will break. If someone is stressed long enough, they will collapse. If someone is challenged repeatedly, they will eventually show a visible crack. That belief helps people make sense of the world and their place in it. But when they encounter someone who does not follow that pattern, their sense of prediction starts to fail. Your endurance becomes something they cannot easily measure. Situations that are supposed to wear you down don't produce the reaction they expect. Pressure that should lead to visible change does not produce visible collapse. Even repeated attempts to provoke emotional or mental instability don't create the response they are familiar with in others. And that creates confusion, because people often build their understanding of others based on what they have seen before. When someone fits into that pattern, everything feels normal. But when someone stays steady beyond the point where most people would visibly struggle, observers begin to adjust their expectations without realizing it. At first, they may assume it is temporary. They wait for the moment when you finally react. They observe more closely. They increase attention, not always out of hostility, but out of curiosity mixed with disbelief. When that expected breaking point doesn't arrive, their interpretation changes. Instead of assuming you are unaffected, they start questioning how far your endurance actually goes. And when something cannot be easily measured, people tend to talk about it more to make sense of it. That is where the noise comes from. Not necessarily from your weakness, but from their inability to find the limit they assumed would eventually appear. Your consistency beyond expectation forces them to reconsider what they thought they understood about pressure and response. Number 10. Your silence is not what unsettled them. Your clarity is. A lot of people misunderstand what actually makes others uncomfortable in social situations. They assume it is silence, distance, or emotional unavailability. But silence alone is not what creates tension. People can handle silence when they believe they understand what is happening underneath it. What unsettles them is when silence is backed by awareness they cannot easily read. That is where clarity comes in. When you understand a situation clearly, but do not feel the need to announce it, defend it, or over-explain it, it changes how others perceive you. They can sense that you are not confused, you are not guessing, you are not emotionally lost in what is happening. You are simply observing, processing, and choosing your response carefully. And that level of internal clarity is what people struggle to interpret, because most people are used to others revealing their thoughts through reaction. Confusion shows up as over-talking. Emotional discomfort shows up as defensiveness. Lack of understanding shows up as constant questioning. So when someone does not display those signals, others begin to assume something deeper is going on. Your clarity becomes noticeable in how little you need to adjust yourself in real time. You do not rush to fix misunderstandings that do not concern you. You do not overcorrect impressions that are already formed. You do not react just to prove you are paying attention. Instead, you move with intention, not urgency. And that creates a gap. People try to fill that gap with interpretation. They talk about you more because they are trying to figure out what you already seem to understand without effort. Your calm is not what disturbs them. It is the sense that you are already a step ahead in understanding what others are still trying to process. When someone feels read without being able to fully read back, they start to speak more, not less. Not always out of hostility, but out of a need to regain balance in perception. Number 11. They recognize that others listen to you differently. One of the most subtle things people notice, even before they fully understand it, is how attention shifts when you speak. It is not always obvious, and it is not always dramatic, but it is consistent enough to make people pause internally. The room doesn't necessarily go silent, but something about how others respond changes in a way that is hard to ignore. People start listening a little more closely when you talk. Not because you are trying to be loud or impressive, but because your words don't feel random to them. There is a sense that what you say carries weight, even if it is said casually. And once others begin to notice that shift, they start paying attention to how people around you respond as well. That is where the awareness builds. Some people begin to notice that others repeat your words later, or reference your opinion even when you are not present, or pause slightly longer when you speak before responding. These are small things, but they accumulate into a pattern that is difficult to unsee once it is noticed. And when people observe that kind of response, they begin to question why it is happening. They don't always see it as respect or influence at first. Sometimes they interpret it as coincidence. Sometimes they assume they are overthinking it. But over time, the pattern repeats enough that it becomes harder to dismiss. Instead of accepting it quietly, people often start discussing it. They bring it up indirectly. They ask subtle questions. They mention how others seem to react differently around you. Not always in admiration, sometimes in confusion, sometimes in curiosity, and sometimes in discomfort. Because when someone notices that attention is shifting in ways they did not expect, it disrupts their understanding of social balance. They start comparing how people respond to you versus how they respond to others. And that comparison creates noise. Not necessarily because you demanded attention, but because attention itself started behaving differently around you. And people are trying to understand why without openly admitting they have already noticed it. Number 12. They are not used to someone refusing invisible social contracts. Most people don't realize how much of their daily behavior is guided by unwritten rules. Not laws, not formal instructions, but subtle expectations that everyone learns to follow over time. Things like when to speak, when to stay quiet, what opinions are safe in certain spaces, what emotions are acceptable to show, and which topics are better left untouched. These rules are not always spoken, but they are strongly felt. Over time, people start adjusting themselves to fit inside these invisible agreements because it makes social life easier. It reduces conflict. It helps them blend in. It keeps relationships predictable. And without even noticing, many begin to prioritize fitting in over questioning whether the agreement itself makes sense. Then someone comes along who doesn't follow those patterns automatically. You don't always reject things loudly. Sometimes you just don't participate in them. You don't force agreement where you don't agree. You don't laugh at things that don't feel funny to you. You don't pretend to understand something just to avoid awkwardness. You don't modify your responses just to match what is expected in that moment. And that creates friction in environments where people are used to unspoken alignment. Because when one person stops participating in the invisible structure, others suddenly become aware of it. What used to feel natural now feels exposed. What used to go unquestioned now feels noticeable. And that awareness makes some people uncomfortable, even if they cannot immediately explain why. So instead of addressing the structure itself, attention often shifts toward the person who is not following it. They begin to talk about you more. They try to interpret your behavior. They label your actions in ways that make them easier to process, not because what you are doing is wrong, but because it interrupts something they are used to relying on without thinking. The noise that follows is often less about you personally, and more about people trying to stabilize a system that suddenly feels visible through your refusal to quietly follow it. Number 13. They sense that your path is not reversible anymore. People are usually comfortable around others as long as they believe change is still flexible. As long as they assume someone can still be influenced, redirected, or shaped by opinions, pressure, or time, there is a sense of control in how they interpret that person. It creates the feeling that nothing is final, that things can still go back and forth, and that outcomes are still adjustable. But something shifts when they begin to sense that your direction is no longer easily reversible. It doesn't have to be announced. It shows up in consistency, in the way you stop revisiting old patterns, in the way your decisions stop depending on external approval, in the way you no longer treat every opinion as something that could change your direction. Over time, people begin to notice that you are not in a phase of experimentation anymore. You are in a phase of alignment, and that changes how they relate to you. Because when people feel someone is still flexible, they talk casually, they test reactions, they suggest alternatives, they offer opinions freely, and they assume influence is still available. But when they sense that influence is no longer effective in the same way, their behavior changes. They become more observant, more careful, more analytical. They start discussing you instead of directly engaging with you, not because you became distant, but because your direction feels settled in a way they cannot easily interfere with. This creates noise because it disrupts expectations. People are used to being part of each other's adjustments, even in small ways. When someone stops adjusting, it forces others to realize they are no longer part of that process. So conversations about you increase, interpretations multiply, opinions become more frequent. Not always negative, not always positive, but more frequent because people are trying to make sense of a direction they cannot easily influence anymore. The core discomfort is not distance, it is finality. The feeling that your path has started moving in a direction that does not require permission, validation, or correction from others anymore. Number 14. The noise is not about exposure. It is about recognition happening earlier than expected. Most people assume recognition only makes sense when it follows visible achievement. They believe attention, discussion, and public reaction should come after something has fully shown itself in the physical world. After success is obvious, after results are undeniable, after everything is already established. That is the timeline most people are comfortable with because it feels logical and predictable. But in reality, human perception does not always wait for results before it reacts. Sometimes people begin responding to someone before anything is fully visible, not because there is proof, but because there is a sense of direction, a consistency in behavior, a shift in mindset, a change in presence that makes others pay attention earlier than expected. It is not always something they can explain clearly, but it is something they notice anyway. And when recognition happens too early in that process, it creates confusion in others, because they are not used to reacting to something that is still forming. They are used to reacting to finished outcomes, not early signals. So when they start noticing you before anything official or obvious has happened, they try to make sense of why that awareness is already there. That is where the noise begins. Some people start talking about you more because they are trying to justify their own attention. Others become skeptical because they think attention should not exist yet. Others become curious because they feel something developing, but cannot fully define it. All of these reactions create discussion that seems larger than the situation itself. What is actually happening is simple. People are responding to early signs of consistency and direction, not final outcomes. But because they expected silence until results arrived, the early awareness feels out of place. So instead of ignoring it, they start commenting on it. The noise is not proof of arrival. It is proof that people noticed movement before it officially declared itself. What runs through all of this is a simple truth most people don't say out loud. When someone becomes harder to read, harder to predict, and harder to influence, people around them don't stay neutral for long. They start reacting. They start talking. They start trying to interpret what they cannot easily place inside their usual understanding of people. And that is really what this noise is about. It is not always about you doing something loud or dramatic. It is often about you no longer fitting into the quiet expectations people once had for you. The expectations that made you easy to categorize, easy to explain, easy to overlook, or easy to control in conversation. The moment those expectations stop working, people don't always adjust silently. They react outwardly instead. Some become curious and start observing you more closely. Some become uncomfortable because they cannot quickly define what you represent anymore. Some start comparing you to older versions of yourself that no longer exist. Others start talking in circles, trying to find a version of the story that makes them feel settled again. And in all of that, your name becomes a topic, not necessarily because of what you are doing wrong, but because of what they cannot fully understand yet. The deeper pattern underneath it all is this. People are always trying to restore mental balance when something disrupts their expectations. And when a person evolves in a way that cannot be immediately measured or explained, that balance gets disturbed. The easiest way for many to cope with that disturbance is not silence, but conversation. Not understanding, but commentary. So what feels like noise around you is often just other people trying to catch up with what they have already sensed, even before they fully understand it. The important thing is not to get distracted by that noise or let it define your direction. People will always have reactions to what they cannot immediately categorize. That is not a reflection of your confusion. It is often a reflection of theirs. Stay grounded in your own clarity, not in external interpretation. If this message resonated with you, take a second to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future insights like this. Like the video if it added value to your perspective. Drop a comment and share your thoughts, and share it with someone who needs to hear it too. Stay awakened, chosen ones.